Good morning, everybody. I want to start thanking the organizers for inviting me today and making this possible. This is a great opportunity, and I'm very, very excited to see all the other presentations here. I apologize in advance because I'm still getting out of this cold, so I only have half a voice left. But I'm going to try to do as good as possible. So I'm Gloria. I'm coming from Columbia University in New York, although originally from Barcelona, Spain. And I'm going to present a fragment of my master thesis today. I would like to start by showing these strikingly different maps that, however, they all represent the same thing, the globe. When we think about mapping, we have this tendency of envisioning this objective, rational, and precise depiction of what we call the real world. However, this shows the central danger of cartography. Maps are often considered as scientific tools of analysis, that from their neutrality pedestal, they yield power over people by convincing them of the truthfulness of what they represent. However, in order to translate the information from the ground to the representational tool, the process of mapping follows a series of abstracting steps. Each step implies a decision, what is included and what is left outside, which categories are used, and which forms of representation we use for each category. Maps, then, fall prey to the intrinsic duality of any representational tool, the same abstraction process that allows for representation entails a creation of a particular view of that space. Maps are part of a loop that involves at least two actors, the map maker and the map user, and both have agency in how the map acts as a representational tool of the ground. As a consequence, the spatial conceptualizations resulting from map generation processes transform them into not only readers, but also producers of place and social identities. In this way, a loop is initiated, where space informs the representation, where representation influences space and its inhabitants. Planners, urban designers, architects, and other professions in the field of city making constantly use maps as a tool to spur this feedback loop between the represented and the representation. But which kind of rules govern the construction of maps? There's a combination of scientific rules and cultural frameworks. So the process of creation is dependent on a specific system of abstraction as well as a particular instance of a socio-historical perspective. I'm interested in exploring this feedback loop created between the represented and the representation and understand how scientific and cultural frameworks have played a role into it. In order to do so, I'm analyzing the relationship between mapping and planning focused in a specific topic, neighborhoods. Neighborhoods can be understood as an example of spaces that are representative for the community, being labeled as symbolic and emotional or connected with a sense of belonging, identity, and social capital. Therefore, they are especially susceptible at being influenced by spatial representations and an interesting subject for this kind of analysis. I'm going to focus in New York from 1970 to today. In this time frame, I'm going to be looking across 7 different administrations with very different challenges to face and agendas to implement. I will look especially at a specific turning point, the creation of the NTAs. The NTAs, or Neighborhood Tabulation Areas, are a data set created by the Department of City Planning of New York in 2010 to project populations at a small scale. Their aim originally was to serve Plan NYC, a long-term sustainability plan by Bloomberg administration, developed for the city. Although they aimed at working at the neighborhood scale, their spatial boundaries do not exactly replicate them. To make this longitudinal comparison, I use different materials or documentation sources. Firstly, official neighborhood maps of New York published by different administrations. Secondly, citywide plans of New York published by the Department of City Planning. From the first round, where I chose 12 of them, I studied 8 of them more in depth. Thirdly, neighborhood maps included in those selected plans. And finally, I interviewed 14 professionals involved in the drafting of the plans and the maps included in the plans. The rest of my presentation will summarize the findings that I have considered inside like this loop. From the ground to the concept, or what I call operationalization. From the concept to the map, or what I call mapping. And from the map to the plan, or planning. I'm going to start with operationalization. Although neighborhoods have been considered as a universal and timeless concept, there are multiple definitions of neighborhoods that have also been evolving through time, and different individuals perceive neighborhoods differently. These circumstances make them difficult to grasp, to represent, or map. As a consequence, the operationalization of the concept neighborhood has been changing throughout all these plans that I studied. And the changes depend on two main elements, the administration agenda or planning practices, which I understood under the goals of the plan. In order to break down the operationalization of neighborhood, I'd look at several parameters for each plan. The information was both extracted from a qualitative analysis of the plan and asking to the planners that were interviewed. I looked at the presence of the word neighborhood or its use, or how neighborhoods were considered during the planning process. We can see here a summary of the different approach on the different plans throughout time. If we look specifically at two of them, we can understand more in depth their differences. For instance, for open space and the future of New York in 1988, that's a plan very community-driven and process-based. And planners involved would say, the focal point was the neighborhood. Back then, there was a strengthening of the concept that neighborhood planning was the right perspective to take on the evolution of the city. However, if we compare it with the approach of planners of Plan NYC, the one that introduced the NTAs, planners would say, when you plan at the neighborhood level, there is an intrinsic bias. You plan for the neighborhoods that you know about, and you neglect the neighborhoods that you don't know about. Neighborhoods where planners don't go become neglected. In order to avoid that bias, we have to look at data. We can only avoid the bias by asking the right questions and looking at the right data. In general, plans from the 70s and 80s would have a more community-focused and process-driven approach, while latest plans are more technocratic and data-driven. The presence and the use of the word neighborhood also gives indications on its conceptualization. Initially, there is a higher interest or connection of neighborhoods with preservation, rehabilitation, diversity, distinctive characters, or even mixed use. While more recently, neighborhoods are tied to concepts as housing, affordable housing, or development. The next step in the loop is the process of mapping, or bridging the gap between the concept and the map itself. In order to break down how neighborhoods were mapped, both the maps of the within the plans were analyzed, and also planners were questioned about the process of creations and the use of the maps within the plan. To explain the process and the findings a little bit better, I will compare one of the earliest plans, neighborhood preservation in New York City from 1973, to two of the latest ones. Plan NYC from 2007, which is the one that introduced the NTAs of Bloomberg, and the most recent one NYC. We can appreciate that in 1973, the areas that are part of the study are highlighted in a hatch, and the rest of the map is acting just as a reference, while in this other map of the right, which is the one that for the first time introduced neighborhood tabulation areas, every inch in the city is included and divided in polygons. Every part is included in the analysis and ranked through a color scale. This implies that every area of the city is considered a neighborhood. There is no room for areas not being a neighborhood. It's comprehensive and its boundaries are contiguous. If we abstract the form of representation, we can see the tendencies even more clearly. In the map of the left, certain areas are the total focus of attention, and the rest is just reference, secondary. While in the map of the right, the boundaries are the focus of attention and cover the whole city, implying that every inch of it is a neighborhood. I have summarized the ways of representation in diagrams that are on top that I will use to compare with other plans. If instead of looking at Plan NYC, we look at one NYC, the one of 2015, we can see how, although certain areas are highlighted, the same data set is used for the analysis process, also being comprehensive. We can compare other maps in the same plans, and we can see the same tendencies. If we look overall how the evolution of representation over time, we can appreciate a tendency to transition to the more comprehensive approach in the latest years. In this sense, the use of GIS and current mapping tools seem to be acting as normalizers, forcing categorization and equal representation of the city. All neighborhoods have to be represented in the same way. All the city has to be a neighborhood. And all the boundaries have to be coincident and adjacent. The methodology prevails, and being able to embed the object of the analysis, in this case the neighborhood, becomes more important than finding the right way of representing it. Therefore, differences are flattened in order to be able to include them in the model. Finally, the last step, planning. As we have discussed before, the concept of neighborhood as more complex ideas is difficult to abstract because there is no single operationalization. If we represent the approach to operationalizing neighborhoods, we could show it in a sequence of concentric circles, from the more specific in the middle to the more abstract in the outside. In the analyzed plans, I have detected two approaches: the inductive, going from the specific neighborhood to the city through an iterative process of case studies and aggregating them to understanding whole cities, and the deductive, going from the city in general to the specific by using data to compare the parameters of all neighborhoods and then choosing those that have selected characteristics. If we compare the comments of the planners, we can see that how the mapping approach also represents these two inductive and deductive approaches to planning neighborhoods. There was the assumption that maps would be used as a tool for analysis, walk the neighborhood with the map and take notes. Or maps were used a lot to decide which areas to prioritize and where to locate needed services. Looking at the tendencies of all the maps studied, we can detect a transition from a more case study-based approach to one that goes from the city to the neighborhood, or from a more inductive one to a deductive one. So finally, what does all this study tell us about the connection between mapping and planning? That there's a relationship that can be established between how neighborhoods are first operationalized, then how they are mapped, and how they are planned in New York City. The map of neighborhoods in New York City is then an unreachable concept, as each map created is just a caption of a single vision of a city, with underlying objectives, agencies, and biases. This supports the theory that mapping is not an objective scientific process, but an act with agency. Consequently, the goals of an administration or the planning practices will highlight how the maps of neighborhoods in New York City look like, and then how these same neighborhoods will be planned in the future. Mapping is an act with intention. Quote, thus, the various cartographic procedures of selection, schematization, and synthesis make the map already a project in the making. In fact, mapping is perhaps the most formative and creative act of any design process. Or, making a connection with Thomas Bernard's presentation, the act of creation includes both inventory and invention, as when compiling inventories, we're setting up the rules of the inventions that are to be made. As such, creative researchers and designers should keep a critical perspective on the use and interpretation of maps, even the most official and apparently objective ones, such as the one provided by an administration, such as the Mayor's Office or the Department of City Planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gloria. Does anyone have a question for Gloria? No? I have a... Oh, you have a question?
It's fascinating by the moment the question came up in my mind, and you just answered it by mentioning the switch from what would be hand drawing to GIS systems that would generate maps almost automatically. And you said that these representation that will use digital mapping, that the representation has to be this way. And I was puzzled by the word has, and I'd like to hear you a little bit more on the agency of the tools that are being used and that switch, because it seems like if the later maps are drawn this way, and I think that your analysis is quite interesting in the way that we can read them as, the neighborhood has to be drawn. It's are the tools that we are using to map neighborhoods now, are they forcing our hand to represent this a certain way, or is there some agency left there? How much is in the tool and how much is in the body or people doing the mapping?
I believe every kind of tool that we use for representation gives certain constraints or rules, and we have to be conscious of these rules in order to know how to break them when it's necessary, or to be aware of which limits they are imposing on us. So, as you were saying, the latest maps, there has been this introduction of this data set that is being used as a proxy of neighborhood in New York, which are neighborhood tabulation areas. This data set was created in 2010, and originally it wasn't even intended to be a data set representing neighborhoods. It was just a smaller scale of analysis to project population. However, planners have always had this intention or need to represent somehow neighborhoods, and the lack of boundaries or a single representation of neighborhoods is something that it has always bothered them. And the fact of this data set that would approximate neighborhoods being available for them, it implied that a lot of people would start just using it and just associating its scale with neighborhoods. This is what's dangerous, because with all these steps, from the people that created the data set to the people that are using this data set, there are all these implications that the users or the representatives, the map makers, are not aware of. And GIS methods, or certain GIS methods, do impose certain constraints in the analysis. The use of polygonal systems imply that all the information within is equal for each polygon. So the boundaries that you set are very important. This is, I don't know, for GIS users, the MAUP problem or the ecological fallacies. And it's interesting because a lot of planners were complaining about the difficulty of representing neighborhoods because of a problem of a scale of the city and a problem of setting boundaries, which are exactly the same problems that the MAUP problem or fallacy poses. That's why this question arises of do we actually have these problems, or is our method of drawing these neighborhoods that is actually giving us these problems? I don't know if I answered the question. Oh, okay, great, thanks.
Would anyone else like to ask a question to Gloria? No? Okay, well, thank you, Gloria.